Chapter 6. Winston was writing in his diary. It was 3 years ago. It was a dark evening on a narrow side street near one of the big railway stations. She stood near a doorway, under a street lamp that hardly provided any light. She had a young face, heavily painted. The paint attracted me, the whiteness of it, like a mask, and the bright red lips. Party women never paint their faces. There was no one else in the street, and no telescreens. She said $2. For a moment, I found it too difficult to continue. He shut his eyes and pressed his fingers against them, trying to push away the memory that kept coming back. He felt an overwhelming urge to shout a string of curses at the top of his lungs, or to bang his head against the wall, kick over the table, and throw the inkpot through the window, to do anything that might erase the memory tormenting him. He realized your worst enemy was your own nervous system. At any moment, the stress inside you could show itself in a visible way. He recalled a man he had passed in the street a few weeks earlier, a tall, thin, ordinary-looking party member, about 35 to 40, carrying a briefcase. They were just a few meters apart when the left side of the man's face suddenly twisted in a spasm. It happened again just as they passed each other. It was only a twitch, a quick movement, but clearly habitual. He remembered thinking at the time, "That poor guy is finished." What was frightening was that the action was possibly unconscious. The most serious danger of all was talking in your sleep. There was no way to guard against that, as far as he could see. He took a breath and continued writing. I went with her through the doorway and across a backyard into a basement kitchen. There was a bed against the wall, and a lamp on the table, turned down low. His teeth ground together, he would have liked to spit. While thinking of the woman in the basement kitchen, he also thought of Catherine, his wife. Winston was married, had been married at least. Probably he still was married, since he believed his wife was not dead. He could almost smell the warm, stuffy odor of the basement kitchen, a mix of bugs, dirty clothes, and cheap perfume, but it was strangely appealing. No party woman ever used perfume or could be imagined as doing so. Only the proles used it. In his mind the scent was tied closely to sex. When he had been with that woman, it had been his first slip in about 2 years. Of course, consorting with prostitutes was forbidden, but it was one of those rules that you could sometimes convince yourself to break. It was risky, but not a life-and-death matter. Getting caught with a prostitute might lead to 5 years in a forced labor camp, not more, if you had no other offenses. It was fairly easy, as long as you could avoid getting caught in the act. The poorer neighborhoods were full of women ready to sell themselves. Some could even be bought with a bottle of gin, which the proles were not supposed to drink. The party even seemed to encourage prostitution as a way to release instincts that could not be completely suppressed. Mere debauchery didn't matter much, as long as it was secret and joyless and only involved women from a despised class. The unforgivable crime was promiscuity among party members. But, even though this was one of the crimes that those accused in the Great Purges always admitted to, it was hard to imagine such a thing actually happening. The party's goal was not just to stop men and women from forming connections it could not control. Its real unspoken purpose was to take all pleasure from sex. Not love, but desire was the enemy, both within and outside marriage. All marriages among party members had to be approved by a designated committee, and, though the principle was never clearly stated, permission was usually denied if the couple seemed to have any physical attraction to one another. The only recognized reason for marriage was to have children for the party's service. Sex was viewed as a minor, slightly unpleasant procedure, like having a medical exam. This again was never outright stated, but it was subtly instilled in every party member from childhood. There were even organizations like the Junior Anti-Sex League, which promoted total celibacy for both genders. All children were meant to be conceived through artificial insemination, artsum, it was called in newspeak, and raised in public institutions. Winston knew this was not fully serious, but it fit the broader ideology of the party. The party was trying to suppress the sex drive, or if that wasn't possible, twist it into something dirty. He wasn't sure why it was this way, but it felt natural that it was. And regarding women, the party's efforts had largely succeeded. He thought again of Catherine. It must be 9, 10, almost 11 years since they had separated. It was odd how seldom he thought of her. He could go days without remembering he had ever been married. They had been together for about 15 months. The party did not allow divorce, but it encouraged separation when there were no children involved. Catherine was a tall, fair-haired girl, very straight and with graceful movements. She had a bold, aquiline face, one that might be called noble, until you realized there was hardly anything behind it. Early in their marriage, he decided, though perhaps he only knew her better than most people, that she had without exception the most foolish, empty mind he had ever encountered. She had no thoughts in her head that weren't slogans, and there was no nonsense she couldn't swallow if it came from the party. He nicknamed her the human soundtrack in his mind. Yet he could have managed living with her if it hadn't been for one thing: sex. As soon as he touched her, she seemed to wince and stiffen. Holding her felt like embracing a wooden figure. Strangely enough, even when she was holding him, he felt as if she was pushing him away with all her might. The tension in her muscles gave off that feeling. She would lie there with her eyes shut, neither resisting nor engaging, just submitting. It was incredibly awkward and, after a while, horrifying. But even then, he could have tolerated living with her if they had agreed to stay celibate. Curiously, it was Catherine who rejected this idea. They had to produce a child if they could, she insisted. So the routine continued once a week, whenever it was not impossible. She would even remind him in the morning that it was something they had to do that evening, and mustn't forget. She had 2 names for it: making a baby and our duty to the party. Yes, she had actually said that. Soon he began to dread the appointed day. Luckily no child came, and she eventually agreed to stop trying, and soon after they separated. Winston sighed silently. He picked up the pen again and wrote. She threw herself down on the bed and immediately, without any kind of introduction, and in the most crude way, pulled up her skirt. He imagined himself standing there in the weak lamplight, smelling bugs and cheap perfume, feeling a mix of defeat and anger that mingled with thoughts of Catherine's white body, forever frozen by the party's hypnotic control. Why did it always have to be like this? Why couldn't he have a woman of his own instead of these filthy encounters every few years? But a real relationship seemed almost unimaginable. The women in the party were all the same. Chastity was as deeply ingrained in them as loyalty to the party. Through careful conditioning, games, cold baths, the garbage drilled into them at school, and in the Spies and Youth League, as well as lectures, parades, songs, slogans, and military music, the natural feelings had been forced out. He knew there must be exceptions, but his heart didn't believe it. They were all untouchable, just as the party intended. What he wanted, even more than love, was to break through that wall of virtue, even if it was just once in his life. The successful act of sex was rebellion. Desire was thought crime. Even to have awakened Catherine, if he could have done it, would have felt like seduction, even though she was his wife. But the rest of the story had to be written down. He wrote, I turned up the lamp when I saw her in the light. After the dark, the dim glow of the lamp seemed bright. For the first time, he could truly see the woman. He stepped toward her, halting, filled with desire and fear. He was painfully aware of the risks he had taken coming here. It was entirely possible that the patrols would catch him on his way out. For all he knew, they might be waiting outside the door right now. If he left without even doing what he had come to do, it had to be recorded, it had to be confessed. What he suddenly saw in the light was that the woman was old. The makeup was piled on so thick it looked like it could crack like cardboard. There were streaks of gray in her hair, but the truly horrible detail was that her mouth hung slightly open, revealing only a dark void. She had no teeth at all. He wrote quickly in messy handwriting. When I saw her in the light she was at least 50, but I went ahead and did it anyway. He pressed his fingers against his eyelids again. He had finally written it down, but it made no difference. The urge to shout filthy words at the top of his voice was just as strong as ever. If you like our recordings, consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, so you don't miss any more audiobooks. And next part coming soon. Till then, take care, bye.